Well, dinosaurs, where do they fit in with the Bible? When I was young, and that was a long time ago, and apparently you're trying to work out how many years ago it was, but I'm not going to give any secrets away. I was very puzzled by the dinosaurs. My friends at school were all keen on these newly found discoveries of dinosaurs, and I couldn't fit them in within the Bible framework. I didn't believe in evolution, and they were just a puzzle, and so I just blanked them out from my mind and just pretended they didn't exist, which of course is not the right answer. And it wasn't until I was about 14, 15 that my father gave me a little booklet which opened my eyes as to where the dinosaurs fit in. And so I've always been interested in dinosaurs. And so what we're going to do is to see how they are animals which God created, went with Noah into the ark, came out from the ark, and eventually died out. That's what we're going to find out. But what is the thinking of the world around us about dinosaurs? Well, what do? We Google, we go to Wikipedia, and what does Wikipedia say? Well, this I took a couple of years ago. Dinosaurs first appeared during the Triassic period, 231.4 million years ago. Note the accuracy there. And were the dominant terrestrial vertebrates for 135 million years, from the beginning of the Jurassic, about 201 million years ago, until the end of the Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, when the extinction events led to the extinction of most of the dinosaur groups. Well, I thought 231.4, that's a remarkable skill to be able to work out such accuracy. So I did check this afternoon, and in fact they have amended it, and it is now reads 243.231 million years ago. But the chart that was alongside it was exactly the same as the chart of 2 years ago, which was headed 231.4 million years ago. So I haven't changed the quote because that's in there. So we can't visualize that vast period of time. We believe in creation about 6,000 years ago. Now, I'm not exactly sure what the width of the screen is, but I'm going to guess it's about 2 meters long. So if we think of that arrow, 2 meters long, as representing 6,000 years, how long an arrow would we have to draw to represent 231.4 million years ago? So here's a 4-part question. Any hands up for part 1? Answer 1, A, 18,500 times longer than that line there. Or B, 28. Any takers for B? No? Any takers for C? Any takers for D? Yes. Well, you're wrong, because it's C. I used to do it with just the 3, and everybody said the last one, so I thought I'll be crafty. I'll add another one. So the answer is that. So in reality, it would be 77 kilometres long. So try to imagine, here we are at Midland, 65% of the way to Toronto will be the length of the arrow you would have to draw to represent that amount of time. So that's a long, long arrow. And on that time scale, mankind is supposed to have come into being Homo sapiens. They talk about 200,000 years ago, which will be, this is where I've lost, I added some notes and they've just disappeared off into the ether. So what's 6,000 into 200,000 goes about 31 times. So man on that scale appears 31 screens, 60 meters. The corridor down the side there is 80 meters long. Yeah. But it just gives us some idea that to mankind, the evolutionists, immense period of times, anything can happen in that time. And we say absolute rubbish. I'm quite sure that what the Bible says is true. We can stick to the creation account in Genesis 1 that God created a few thousand years ago, the heavens and the earth and all that was therein. So some of the problems with putting back dinosaurs as living millions of years ago is that we find that some of the remains of the dinosaurs aren't fossilized but are fresh, which is a bit hard to think of something being dead for millions of years has existed and still remains fresh. And some of the bones are smelly. There is a special smell associated with dead bodies, and some of these dinosaur bones that they find have got this smelliness about them. And now more recently they found blood in dinosaur bones which are allegedly millions of years old, and everybody knows that blood doesn't last that long. And also we have many man-made depictions of dinosaur-like creatures. Now, the dinosaurs are supposed to have died out a long, long time before man came along into the arena on the thinking of the evolutionists. And so we've got to say, well, how is it that people were able to draw, to carve, to sculpt things that we were saying, oh, that's a dinosaur, if they hadn't seen them? And also in the fossils where we find the dinosaurs, we find remains of creatures which are every bit alive today, even trees, which are a tree growing in my garden that comes from the age of the dinosaurs. And it makes you think, well, there must be something wrong with their dating process. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to look at dinosaurs, see the distribution of them, look at some of the worldwide depictions of them, look at living fossils, how things which are supposed to be extinct, actually many of them are still alive. And look at, are the dinosaurs still alive today? And look at this aspect of the fresh bones and the blood, etc. And then ask the question, well, why don't we find dinosaurs in the Bible? If God created them, why don't we find dinosaurs in the Bible? Or are they? And we shall look at some passages there. And we shall see, yes, they were part of God's creation. They did live at the same time as man, and their demise was caused by the flood. So, very briefly at the end, if we get to the end, Jurassic Park. Fiction makes far more money than reality, yes. So we find remains of dinosaurs all over the world. They're not unique to any country, but you can find dinosaur remains, as I say, north, south, east, west, everywhere. Little tiny ones, great big ones. The bigger ones, of course, take the attention. There's a man at the bottom there, at the bottom of the screen there, to give you an idea of scale. So a Brachiosaurus, about 13 metres high. You're working metres here, don't you? Yeah. Supersaurus, about 17 metres high. A Sauropodean, about 18 metres high. Now, I'm just wondering how high this room is. I guess about 10 feet high, about 3 metres high. So you imagine something 6 stories up. If its feet were down here, its head would be 6 stories up. And the granddaddy of them all has just recently been found in Argentina in May of 2014. These huge bones, and in fact you can see this chap lying on bone, are obviously a huge, huge creature, and there's an artistic representation of it, 40 metres from nose to tail, 20 metres high. Titanosauria, the biggest one of them all. Now, we can't be sure, but it seems to be the case that about 95% of the dinosaurs were plant eaters. It's not, you can't easily tell from a fossil what it ate, but the clues are that the majority of dinosaurs were plant eaters. I say they weren't all huge things. Some dinosaurs were chicken size. And remember that every dinosaur started off from an egg, and the biggest egg they've ever found is no bigger than a rugger ball. So, no, not very big at all. But as we shall see later on, one of the things about cold-blooded creatures is that they carry on growing until they die. Not like humans, we get to a certain age, and thankfully for our parents, we stop growing. But cold-blooded creatures carry on growing. The longer they live, the bigger they get. Not only dinosaur land creatures, but sea creatures and huge bird-like creatures, fossils have been found of all of those. Now, with all dinosaurs, with all fossils, we don't find any intermediary. There's no evidence of an evolution that this one evolved into that, evolved into that. That all found as complete species, but so often they're just a jumble of bones. And from a jumble of bones, somebody's got to try and piece them together and draw a picture of what they think it looks like. And that's the rub. Just from a series of bones, you cannot tell what a creature looks like. Even if we had a pretty good skeleton like we have in this example here, we don't really know what that creature would look like. And here's a couple of examples. There's a creature, and we could draw it, and the artist could come along and make it a little lion. And, it will fit the scale of the skeleton and everything. In fact, it is the skeleton of a poodle. But, from the skeleton, a skeleton of a poodle and a lion look very much alike. You cannot tell just what it is. Here's one of a bird, and you might draw that as a turkey. In fact, it is a peacock, which looks totally different, but you wouldn't know that from just its skeleton. So whatever pictures you see, whatever models you see, whatever pictures I show up on the screen here, are just merely artists' interpretation of what they think it might look like. Give the same bones to 50 different artists, you'll get 50 different pictures. But as I say, normally you just get a mass of bones, so it's not easy at all. Now, in history, there are many accounts of large creatures. There are many ancient pictures of very strange creatures. If one went to Babylon in the time of King Nebuchadnezzar, you would see these wonderful portrayals of horses and donkeys and cows and cats and all sorts of things around. But in among all these beautiful clay tiles depicting the creatures, you find strange creatures like this. And just look at the front legs and look at the back legs. Have you ever seen something with paws at the front and claws at the back? And very strange neck there. Now, one says, well, did the person that did the tiles for this, did he have a lot of cheese the night before and dream of this creature? Or was this something that he knew and understood and was alive in his day? Well, we can't prove one way or the other. But, there are these depictions of creatures which we don't see today. And worldwide accounts of dragons. George, the patron saint of Britain, slaying the dragon. Fire-breathing creatures, counts of those all over the place, especially in China. It is the common origin. We'll come to that. This is from a church not very far from where I live in the UK, Breedon, and this is very ancient carving. This goes back to the 8th to the 9th century AD. And again, there are panels depicting creatures which we recognise, but there is a panel like this one, I think we can enlarge it, that's right, showing bipedal creatures. In other words, they've got strong back legs and rather puny little front legs, but not creatures that you would go out and see on any walk anywhere. These creatures don't exist. So again, one has to say, well, how is it that the artists depicted creatures which we find fossils of and allegedly prehistoric, how did he draw pictures of creatures like that? Was it just from his imagination, or were creatures like this in existence way back 1100 years ago? And in Carlisle, in England, in the cathedral, is the tomb of the Bishop Richard Bell of Carlisle. It's on the floor and a lot of brass on it. It's covered over with a carpet now because the brass is being worn away, but there's a reproduction in more detail. And around the edge of the tomb is a brass piece with wording, and in between the words are little drawings. You can't see them on that scale there, but many are fully recognisable. 4 different kinds of fish, a fox, a bear, a dog and a bird. We can recognise them all. But among them are 2 dinosaur-like creatures. The 2 there are head-to-head. On the tail of this one here looks like little barbed teeth, and they seem to be locked in some embrace there. And this very much looks like a dinosaur-like creature. And again, you know, how did these pictures come there? Were they just pure imagination, just a bit of doodling on the part of the person doing the tomb? Or were these creatures he was acquainted with, were in existence in his day, incorporated them along with the horses and the foxes and the rest? In Cambodia, there's a carving here, and very much like a stegosaurus with these defences on its back. Now, critics say, well, actually, that's perhaps part of the background to the creature, but, you know, it's that type of creature is very much like a stegosaurus. And in Grand Canyon, in the White Rock Canyon in Utah, there is, you can just see a depiction of a man here, and the next drawing has been whited over so we can see it, but very much a sauropod dinosaur. So, you know, whoever drew that was a man, obviously. The dinosaur didn't draw its own picture. So a picture of a man and a picture of a dinosaur, making us think, well, perhaps they did live together. So let's just have it'll all build together, hopefully. Let's just look at living fossils. And one of the greatest examples of a living fossil is a coelacanth. Until 30, 40, 50 years ago, coelacanth was set forth as an example of a creature which is extinct, been extinct for millions of years, 65 million years ago, allegedly. And this is a great example of how a fish was beginning to transform to a creature that could crawl out because it's got these special fins here that enabled it to crawl out of the water and get onto land. And that was, you know, in the textbooks for the evolution of water creatures to land creatures. Until 1938, when a biologist was looking in a market in South Africa and saw on the fish counter a coelacanth, recognised it. And subsequently, they found that there are lots of examples of coelacanth. It's not dead, it's very much alive. And these aren't primitive legs at all. It is a bottom grazer, and it just uses those just to paddle itself along as it grazes along the bottom. The Komodo dragon is another example of a creature which was allegedly extinct, but has more recently, 100 years ago, been discovered, and it's called one of the living examples of prehistoric age of the reptiles. A very vicious creature, very much a dinosaur-type creature. And that was only discovered in 1912. Allegedly extinct for millions of years, but that's not the case at all. And in Australia, they recently uncovered this 23-foot long, so what's that, 7 meters? And that was supposed to have lived 200,000 years ago. And they analysed the bones, and they found it very much was a Komodo dragon, but on a bigger scale than any Komodo dragons they had found to date. Now, we'll come back to that, because remember that I said that these creatures, cold-blooded creatures, would carry on growing. So if man lived much longer ages, the animals would live much longer ages, and these creatures would get to very big sizes. This kapaki, that used to be in the evolutionary depiction of how horses evolved from little tiny horses to the big horses. Absolute rubbish, but never mind. And it was thought to be extinct, and they now find it isn't extinct at all, it's still alive. So it all points to the fact that these the time scales are all wrong. Because evolution was true, then surely these things would have changed after millions of years, but are exactly the same as their ancient fossils. And as I said, not only animals, but plants. The ginkgo biloba leaf is very distinctive, and this is, I've got one of these trees in my garden, very distinctive leaf. And one finds in the fossils this very distinctive leaf. So that tree was in existence in the time when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And so, how is it that even the tree hasn't changed if the dinosaurs were so old? Of course, I have no problem because I don't believe the dinosaurs were old at all. They were contemporary with man. We also have many tales of huge creatures in wild places down in the Congo. This Mokle Mumbi, the blocker of the river. When white man comes to the Congo and that region there and shows the Africans pictures of dinosaurs, and they will look through and say, yes, so well, there's one of those is up the river, and we're very scared of it. Now, white man has not been able to find it. It may just be imagination, we don't know. But here is an example of a prehistoric elephant that was thought to be prehistoric, and only recently, in the last 16 years ago, has this been found. And I have to tell this story, I'm afraid, but I do have a little connection with Blashford Snell, who was a British explorer, went and found these about 20 years ago. 3 o'clock in the morning, Anthea and I are fast asleep in bed. Phone goes, the phone's on her side of the bed, so that when I'm not at home, she can answer it. She's very bleary, picks up the phone and says, yes. And this voice said, Blashford Snell here. And she, as quick as a flash, and I say, being in a deep sleep, said, this is the Queen of Sheba, and put the phone down. I would love to meet him to see if he can remember that. Obviously, a missed call. Anyway, he went to Nepal, and there's Nepal, north of India, and he found these Nepalese elephants, which white man hadn't seen until about 16 years ago, and noticed the very distinct hump on their neck, as it were. Now, we go to France, we go into the caves, and we see there the prehistoric creatures depicted on the cave side there. And they've got exactly that same hump. If we put the Nepalese elephant there, it's exactly the same kind of hump that was there. Now, those are supposed to be prehistoric, millions of years, thousands of years old, and yet the same creatures are still alive. And here's another one. This goes back 40 years, 50 years now, nearly 60 years, isn't it? Time rolls on. Yeah. Shows how old I am. 1961, a petroleum geologist discovered a half-metre thick bone bed. As the bones were fresh, not permineralised, he assumed that these were recent bison bones. It took 20 years for scientists to recognise duck-billed dinosaur bones in this deposit, as well as the bones of horned dinosaurs and large and small carnivorous dinosaurs. So here are fresh dinosaur bones, allegedly 70 million years old. And this article said how these bones could have remained in fresh condition for 70 million years is a perplexing question. And yes, it is a perplexing question. Much more reasonable to think that they aren't that age at all. And that's why they're still fresh. That's been recently buried there. Now at school we're presented with this geological column which is supposed to tell us the age of the Earth, that if we find a particular key fossil, then we know that the age will be, if we see that particular fossil, it will be this particular age. If we find a dinosaur, then we'll be between 150 and 200,000 million years before the present. That is how evolutionists look at these things. I believe a much more rational explanation that this gradation of creatures is the order of their death in the year of the flood. It explains why we only find fossils in sedimentary layers. They all, for fossils, seem to be pointing in the same direction, as if they're associated with passage of water. And water grades out. Different particle sizes drop out at different stages. And it also helps to explain why, in many cases, footprints of man, footprints of dinosaurs, are actually found at lower levels than the actual creatures are supposed to have existed. So we find dinosaur footprint remains in older rock than the Jurassic, and the same with humans. So I believe the flood is the answer to the fossils, but that's another story. So yes, finding blood in dinosaur bones. This indeed was a shocker. This is from the Smithsonian. This is the prestigious US museum, it's Science Museum, Smithsonian Institute. Probing a 68 million year old Tyrannosaurus rex, Mary Schweitzer stumbled upon astonishing signs of life that may radically change our view of these ancient beasts. It was big news indeed last year when Schweitzer announced that she had discovered blood vessels and structures that looked like whole cells within that T-Rex bone, the first observation of its kind, and still elastic material. The finding amazed colleagues who had never imagined that even a trace of still soft dinosaur tissue could survive. After all, as any textbook will tell you, when an animal dies, soft tissues such as blood vessels, muscle and skin decay and disappear over time, while hard tissues like bone may gradually acquire minerals from the environment and become fossils. Schweitzer, one of the first scientists to use the tools of modern cell biology to study dinosaurs, has upended the conventional wisdom by showing that some rock-hard fossils, tens of millions of years old, may have remnants of soft tissues hidden away in their interiors. So that was 2006, and then a more recent observation, a similar thing, this is 2015, an allegedly 80 million year old fossil again confirmed that it had got blood in it, and this wasn't contamination. So that really puzzled them. So there was an interesting article. This poor lady that discovered this had a really hard time of it. She was ostracised by her colleagues. In fact, I think she lost her job. But it's just an interesting comment that was made that she said, I had one reviewer tell me that he didn't care what the data said. He knew what I was finding wasn't possible. I wrote back and said, well, what data would convince you? And he said, no. In other words, his mind was totally blocked. He was convinced this must be very old, fossils are old, therefore there cannot be fresh blood. He wouldn't contemplate the picture that perhaps they answer, therefore we can find fresh blood in them. Yes, this is where it talks about smelly bones. After her first discovery, she noticed that a T-Rex skeleton had a distinctly cadaverous odour. When she mentioned this to long-time paleontologist Jack Horner, he said, oh yeah, all Hell Creek bones smell. But again, you can't imagine smell retaining to a bone over millions of years. Can't imagine over 10 years, let alone 1,000 or a million. And again, in more recent times, in a triceratops horn, again, this chap found soft tissues. One of the great problems was that though allegedly it was 65 million years old, when they did carbon dating, it was only 41,000 years old. So there was a first indication that there was something very wrong with these very old ages. So why don't we find dinosaurs in the Bible? Well, it's a very simple reason for that. The word dinosaur wasn't coined until 1842 by this gentleman, Richard Owen. This was a time when more and more big bones were being found, and he wanted a name, so he put together two Greek works, Dinosaur and Sauros, big, fearful, great reptiles, lizards. So these were the remains, and he used the word dinosaur. So any writings before 1842 will never use the word dinosaur because it's a new, comparatively new word. So we won't find the word dinosaur in the Bible. But do we find descriptions of dinosaurs in the Bible? I believe we do. Genesis chapter 1 tells us in verse 21 that God created great sea creatures, Authorized Version has whales, and every living creature that moveth in the waters brought forth abundantly. Now, that word for great sea creatures is the word galau, great, and tanyin, a marine or land monster. So it's telling us that God created huge creatures in the sea creatures at this time. We believe that he also created land monsters. And that word, taninin, is 35 times, in the Authorized Version anyway, translated as dragons. And I want to introduce you, turn with your Bibles to Job. We're just going to come to it shortly in our readings. Job chapter 40, and have a listen to this description. These are God's words to Job, pointing out the greatness of God and his creation. And he summons up as witnesses to God's greatness this particular creature in verse 15. Now, what I've got up on the screen is New King James, which just makes it a little bit crisper. Just follow it in your Bible. So I'm just going to read from verse 15 to the end of that chapter. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now, his strength is in his hips and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze. His ribs are like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Look now at the behemoth which I made. I'm sorry. I've got presenter's view, and I've been reading the later versions, haven't I? Restart. I thought it was a bit of an no, I've read that, haven't I? That's right. But you didn't see it. I was reading it. Right, so we read that bit. So, right, verse 20. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth, though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. So this behemoth, it's an interesting word. Apparently, I'm no Hebrew scholar, but it has a plural of intensity. This is the beast of beasts, Job. This is my biggest and best of the creatures, the largest and the fiercest of the creatures that I have made. So let's just pull together what God says of this beast of beasts. He's contemporary with man. I made him with you, Joe. He has great strength. He has a tail which is compared to a cedar. I'm sure you have cedar trees here, don't you? Cedar trees? Yep. The characteristic of a cedar tree is it has branches which go out horizontally. Very long branches too. Chief of the ways of God and absolutely fearless. Now, if you've got a marginal reference in mind, it's got against behemoth or the elephant as something. And other versions talk about the hippopotamus. Now, he moves his tail like a cedar. That little thing? That little thing? No. How about this one? A brachiosaurus. Now, he's got a long tail. Now, this is showing my age. This picture is taken from a book that I got for my children when they were young. And in those days, it was thought that these long tails were very cumbersome things that dragged behind the creature, which would be most uncomfortable dragging over the ground. More recent times, and within the last about 10 years, they realised that that wasn't the situation at all. That if I put a more modern picture, that it was a counterweight to the long neck. And museums, natural history museums around the world, shut their doors and readjusted the tails on their dinosaurs because they realised they got them wrong, having them dragging on the ground. They were, let's say, like a counterweight. You've got this very long neck, and there was a counterbalance to it. So there's a more modern drawing with the tail out like that. Now you imagine that whipping backwards and forwards, it would slice you off, no trouble at all. So we can't say that this is the description of this particular creature, or this is the creature that fits this description. But a creature like this would certainly fit the bill of being very strong, very powerful, being something you didn't mess with, and having this huge tail, which was a very characteristic part of this creature. And then God deals with another creature in Job chapter 41, a very long description. It goes on the whole of that chapter there, so I have just selected some of the verses to put up here, otherwise we'll be here for a long time. But this is talking about Leviathan. This is a sea creature. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle, never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, or his graceful proportions. Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, tightly shut up as with a sash. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They're joined one to another, they stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth light. His eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth goeth burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck. Though the sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor does spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. On earth there is none like him, which is made without fear. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. And remember, this is God speaking. God is giving this description of a creature that breathes fire. God knows what he does, what is made. We can trust him. If he says, here is a creature that can breathe fire, then we have to believe it, that such a creature did exist, and Job knew about it. This wasn't a creature that Job wasn't acquainted with. This was a creature that Job knew and recognized how great and mighty this creature was that God had made. And what is man compared with this huge creature? So, another creature, Leviathan, contemporary with man, can't be harpooned, got terrible teeth, strong scales, pointed footprints as it moves, breathes out smoke and fire out of its nostrils, and the king of animals and fearless. Well, again, marginal reference. Can't spot it down the margin, but it says crocodile is the thought. And, well, crocodiles, they do have pointed footprints, they do have close scales, but have you ever seen a crocodile breathing out fire? No, I haven't. And we do have huge remains of crocodile-looking like creatures weighing 8 tons, 12 metres long. But consider this creature, a Parasaurolophus. Wish they'd give them easier names. You see, it's got a funny horn. What use is that horn to a creature? How could you fight with a horn which was behind your head? You'd have to twist your neck round, wouldn't you? Under fight, and you wouldn't be able to see. So perhaps it isn't a horn for fighting. Perhaps it has a different mechanism. And it is thought that this creature was able to produce fire. And here we have the origins of dragon, fire-breathing dragons. Interesting construction to that. It has a nasal passage which comes up from the nose and then goes down and meets a middle passage and a meeting point between two passages there. And it is thought that such a creature could have had different chemicals, and when it needed fire, could mix them together, shoot them out through its nose, and produce fire. Now, if we think of the wonders of creation, the number of electric, light-producing creatures, nothing is outside God's skill. And this little creature, the bombardier beetle, is capable of producing fire, gas at 100 degrees centigrade, and is capable of shooting it out under its body, over its body, and that. And this too has 2 different chambers, has a container containing hydrogen peroxide and another hydroquinone, and the 2 mix in a mixing chamber and go through this muscle, and there's an explosion chamber, and out come these gases at 100 degrees centigrade. And it's able to give up to 20 bursts. And if it is attacked, then it fires fire at its creatures. And as I say, very flexible. It can point it in any direction it likes. It has these paddles which can direct it to where it wants. So we must accept, if God says this creature was able to produce fire, that such a creature did exist. We can see the remains of one creature that does have this strange horn, which perhaps could be for that use, and so it just helps us to see the truth of these things. So there were creatures which Job was acquainted with, which don't exist today, but were very fearsome, and God regarded these as big beasts that he had made for his glory, and to show to man the puniness of man in relation to God's great creation. So why did the dinosaurs die out? Well, the evolutionists will tell us that perhaps a meteorite hit the earth and killed them off. Well, why didn't it kill everything else off? Other theories is that the temperature rose and so they couldn't stand the heat and so they died out, or others say no, it went very cold and they couldn't stand the cold and so they died out. Other theories are they became constipated and eventually died out. Other theories are that they became obese and died out. And one of the latest ones is that there were parasites that attacked their jaws and ate them away. But that's evolutionary ideas. Let's fit it now within a biblical framework. I believe that all these creatures were contemporary with man. They were created by God in Genesis chapter 1 and lived around the world. We find dinosaur and human footprints side by side, and so that shows that they did exist together. We have many historical accounts. Beowulf was born in 495 AD, lived in Denmark, and there is a famous Old English epic poem which tells us of the exploits of Beowulf, how he slew the Grendel. Now, the Grendel was a bipedal creature, two small forelimbs, and had enormously strong jaws. Its skin was impervious to sword blows, a very ugly creature, a very solitary night hunter, and Beowulf slew it by tearing off one of the forelimbs. Now, it just so happens that there is a Babylonian seal showing a chap attacking what we would say it looks a bit like a dragon, a bipedal creature, by grasping its hand and, as it were, twisting it off. So, there's an interesting linkage then. Maybe, that's what this sculpture had in mind, such creatures, that they did exist. God created them, and they were in existence but have subsequently died out. And also, Beowulf was credited with not only getting rid of these dragon-like creatures, but also many sea creatures and flying reptiles. Alexander the Great, he writes in his accounts about how his army encountered a dragon. Marco Polo, 1254 AD, he recorded dealings with dragons. Philostratus, AD 172. The whole of India, he says, is girt with dragons of enormous size. Not only the marshes full of them, but the mountains as well. And there's not a single ridge without one. Now, the marsh kind are sluggish in their habits and are 30 cubits long, and they have no crest standing up on their heads. Pliny the Elder, contemporary with the Lord Jesus, he also refers to the large dragons that could be found in India when he writes his natural history. And there are in Britain many accounts of large creatures terrorising the populations. Geoffrey of Monmouth, he in 1130 put together all the history books that he could find, which were very old in his day, and rewrote them so that their records would be preserved. And he makes mention of a Welsh king who got eaten by a monster in 336 BC. And many accounts in British history of large creatures. And the latest, the last record one can find, just goes back 150 years, 1867. It talks about people being frightened by this monster that lived in the woods at Frittleworth in Sussex. So I believe that many creatures existed. They gradually became extinct because of the hunting of man, hunted to eliminate them exactly the same way as wolves used to occupy Britain, now have been eliminated. Big cats, elephants, tigers. We didn't have elephants, tigers in Britain. But you know how they have been eliminated from many habitable parts by man. I believe the dinosaurs were destroyed partly through the hunting of man. So I believe that God created the dinosaurs for a particular reason. Now, I thought to myself, I guess in Canada they don't know what that picture is about. That's a lawnmower, and I don't think you have push lawnmowers and your huge patches of grass, but that's a lawnmower. And I believe that was the function that God created these huge plant-eating creatures to keep down the abundant vegetation that existed before the flood. And that was their task, to keep mowing the grass, as it were, and pruning down the trees. God will bring them to the ark. Now, bear in mind, so I did say, we've got these huge dinosaurs. How could you fit a huge dinosaur on the ark? Well, you wouldn't fit a huge dinosaur on an ark, because a huge dinosaur meant it's an old dinosaur. And the whole purpose of taking animals onto the ark was so that the earth could be repopulated. So you wouldn't take an old set of dinosaurs, you would take a young set. And ample room on the ark for any number of young dinosaurs, because when they're young, they'll be quite small, as I say. They only started off from an egg that size, even the biggest one. But if they grew and grew and grew and grew, then they will get to the very big size. So no problems getting dinosaurs on the ark at all. Then, after the flood, conditions changed. There wasn't all this abundant vegetation. I don't believe the amount of oxygen and the atmospheric pressure probably changed. And we know certainly that man, instead of living 900 years, presumably if man lived 900 years, presumably dinosaurs probably lived 900 years. We don't know, but much longer than any creatures living today. So shorter lives, they wouldn't grow so big. So, as I said, cold-blooded animals, reptiles like dinosaurs, they don't stop growing until they die. Young couples to the ark, yeah. So if man and animals lived much longer before the flood, we would expect to find fossil remains of creatures which we can recognise today, but on a much bigger scale, because they lived much longer lives. And that is true. We find remains of toads, huge size of toads, far bigger than anything we get today, simply because the different conditions, they lived much longer and therefore grew to bigger sizes. We have ammonites, huge size of ammonite. We don't get ammonites today anywhere like that, but huge size. These are oysters, and from the size of the peak, you can see how huge these oysters are, simply because they carried on growing and growing and lived much longer lives, and therefore got to much bigger sizes. And when the flood came and they were turned into fossils, then we have the remains of these huge things. After the flood, a lighter atmosphere made it very difficult for these creatures, which got very long necks, and made it harder for the blood to be driven up to their brains. There was less food around, probably less oxygen and less energy for them. So gradually they would die out. So contemporary with Job, contemporary with the Old Testament, many Old Testament times, gradually dying out over time until most of the dinosaur-like creatures seem to have gone. But it would account for why we have historic accounts, dragons, fire-breathing creatures, depictions in Babylon, churches in Britain, all round. Have they totally disappeared? Probably not. Probably today's lizards are yesterday's dinosaurs. And so I just put that picture back again, that comment that they made, that really this creature is very much like a Komodo dragon. It just happened to be so much bigger. Well, we have no problem with that, because before the flood, they would live much longer and therefore would attain much bigger sizes. This is modern day Komodos. They only grow to about 3 feet, whereas that one was 3 feet, 3 meters. And that was 7 meters. But Komodos only live about 60 years today. But if it lived to 180 or 200 years, it would grow to 20, 30, 40 feet. Fearful creatures, not very nice at all. And last year I was in New Zealand and I was taken to this museum, a living museum, where these creatures, that's a live creature, tuatara, which means peaks on its back, and this allegedly flourished 200 million years ago, and yet is alive and being bred very successfully at this museum in southern New Zealand. But, you know, quite a dinosaur-looking creature. They only grow up to about 0.8 of a metre, because the growing conditions are such. But again, before the flood, that will grow to a much bigger creature. So the dragons that we see depicted are probably dinosaurs of history, especially that one that God talks about, which was able to breathe fire. So, last slide. Jurassic Park, not that I've seen it, but I understand it's all about recreating from fossilised remains, taking the DNA from it and recreating dinosaur-like creatures. Now again, this is totally outside my field. I'm only saying what I have read. But what I read is that the chances of being able to recreate life from fossilised bones is the equivalent of taking a book which contains 400 pages, so, you know, quite a substantial book, and putting it through the shredder. And your task is to take the sack of shreds and piece it all together. Now, before you put your hand up and volunteer to do that for me, there's one or two things you really need to know, because it has a bearing on the ease of the task ahead of you. One is that it's written in a language which you don't understand, and it's gone through the shredder. Remember, that's all in little strips, so you don't understand that. So that's one little drawback. And the other little drawback that you really ought to know is that I'm going to tie one of your hands behind your back. You only can have one hand to piece all these things together. And to be fair, I ought to tell you about the third problem that you're going to face, is that I'm going to put you in a room which is in total darkness. And the chances of you being able to put together that 400-page book, put all the shreds in the right order, in the language you don't understand, with a hand behind your back, well, it's nigh impossible. But who knows, the skills of man. And of course, one has to tread carefully. Maybe they will be able to, but it would only be that, in reality, the dinosaur bones that they took the DNA from wouldn't be millions of years old. They would be quite recent, because dinosaurs were created by God just a few thousand years ago. But, as I said, fiction makes more money than truth. The first Jurassic Park, which came out in 1993, grossed more than $1 billion. These are American dollars, but they're very similar to your Canadian ones. And Jurassic 5, which came out in 2015, already 1.7 billion. And Part 5 is scheduled for release next year. Well, that's the end of the show, and time has gone. But I hope that helps you to see dinosaurs in different lights. No need to be afraid of them. They are part of God's creation, part of his handiwork. God demonstrated their mighty power to Job. They lived, they died, and we stand in awe of the mighty hand of God, who has created such a wonderful creation. Thank you.